There's never a no. There's never a no when an artist is here. You know, they ask for insane things sometimes that they think are off the wall sonically or crazy, and we try and create an environment where the answer is always yes. Sure, let's do that. Let's give that a shot. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it sonically is a mess, but we never want to be the people who'd be like, nah, no, let's not do that. That sounds horrible. We always want to say, yeah, let's give that a shot. Let's do it. And sometimes that's where the magic comes from. Hey everybody, my name is Matt Hennessy and we are at VSOP Studios Chicago. Welcome to the studio. Early on, before I even started playing anything, I remember hearing Genesis and Phil Collins, and I really connected to the drum sounds and just how bombastic those things were. When I think back on how I mix and how I like audio, I think it really goes all the way back to those Hugh Padgham big drums on face value, and big drums sound like records to me. So let's turn them up. I managed to secure an internship at a studio called Metropolis in Villa Park. You know, I learned just a ton about what the studio business was that year. I mean, I think I was like 17 or something like that, maybe even 16. And, you know, how the console worked, how to kind of put mics on drums loosely. I still didn't even know that this was a job at that point, and I still saw myself as going to be a jazz performer. I was going to be a saxophone player and make jazz records, and I was going to be a star. So I left and went to Berklee College of Music from there with the absolute intent of being a jazz player. And early on in one of your first classes, they sit you down and they do a really good job kind of explaining the landscape of the record business. And so I spent the evening kind of walking around Berklee. You know, the sad Charlie Brown music is playing in my head, like, oh no, what have I done? And I ended up in the basement, and I noticed that there was just amazing music coming out of one of the doors. And I looked in, and there's an SSL console and a 2-inch tape machine. And so I applied to the engineering college and got into that, and began kind of pursuing both angles. I really felt the jazz aspect and the performing arts aspect was really important to complete. To have kind of a whole picture of music in general, as opposed to just being an engineer. There was an amazing studio in the backwoods of Boston, Massachusetts, in Carlisle, called Blue Jay. It was built into this old war-era bunker. In the late 90s, early 2000s, it was still just all analog and all pristine. You know, two Studer 800s, Dolby SRs across the board, you know, insane mic collection that no studio should have. I mean, there wasn't a computer in the entire place. Even the schedule was still kept pencil and paper by hand. And so I got an internship there and really began to learn how to make records. The owner of the studio decided he'd had his run and it was time to get out of the business. And so he sold the studio to the Backstreet Boys, and they changed the aesthetic and changed the vibe, and it just wasn't really what I wanted to do anymore. At that point, I was kind of ready to move back to Chicago, and they were able to hook me up with a gig at Chicago Tracks. We were working on DMX, Grand Champ, Twista, you know, Kanye was coming around, Ludacris was around, a lot of great urban music being made, and I hadn't really done a whole lot of that yet at that point, so it was kind of like a very hard turn and get up to speed really quick sort of situation. To be right there in that moment and to have all this musical training to back it all up and say, like, okay, cool, you know, it can still be musical. We can still make it sonically sound good. We can still make sure that the hooks sound right and are sung right. And it was great to be there from the ground up like that here in Chicago and be around that scene. Eventually, Chicago Tracks closed. I worked at every major studio and every little studio Chicago had to offer. And after doing that for almost a decade, I realized that the right thing to do would be to cultivate a space that was my own. I remember one of the first things I bought was the TubeTech CL1B, still in use today, and I had a Neve 9098 preamp EQ. Kind of that's where we started, trying to have a great vocal chain, good mics and things like that. As any gear obsession goes, it extrapolated very quickly into a lot of gear, and by 2010, we'd really started to outgrow the space, and by 2014, we'd found it, and then began the long process of gutting that building and building what's here at VSOP. But what happened right around the same time was the studio that was Blue Jay, that the Backstreet Boys had bought, they had gotten out of it and it went under. And so all of the gear that was at Blue Jay, which was all, immaculately maintained vintage gear that was bought in the 70s and 80s, basically all went up on the sale block. And Vintage King brokered that deal. And so I remember when I saw that it was happening, I called my guy over there and I was like, yeah, I kind of want all of it. And so I thought that it should all stay together. I felt that if it were to get pieced apart and sent to a zillion different studios, that would be something I couldn't bear. In every record-making process, and every time you're working on a song with an artist, there's a moment where it finally all comes together and everything makes sense. And you have that playback where the arrangement is finally there and you've gotten that killer vocal and everything is recorded in a way that makes sense for the song, and you put it up and you turn it up on the speakers and you play it back and you just get the chills standing up on your arms, and everybody in the room falls silent and just lives in the moment of that song and that record. And those are those moments that they're not duplicatable on a day-to-day basis. When you have that happen and you know that you've created something from thin air, basically, that will emotionally touch people for the rest of eternity, if it exists. That's the special. That's when it's great.